It's my great pleasure to introduce Paul Mason before his lecture today. He's a noted author and esteemed journalist. He, as BBC Newsnight reporter, he covered the 9/11 in New York, the Hurricane Katrina, and the rise of anti-globalization struggles. He was outside of Lehman Brothers when the whole house of cards of global finance started falling apart. Then in 2013, he joined Channel 4 News, for which he was covering, among others, the Greek crisis, political and economic crisis, the 2014 conflict in Gaza, the 2015 independence referendum in Scotland. It's a little bit scary to hosting him in Warsaw because it seems that wherever he goes, something happens. And since 2016, he's a freelance journalist, and most recently, probably you saw him in a series of short films, K for Car, some films on Marx. If you haven't seen them, I do recommend you to watch. I think the first two episodes are on YouTube. Yeah, they're very. I really like the one on alienation. To be very nice. And he's author of 5 great books, 2 of which were translated into Polish. One was Meltdown, The End of the Age of Greed. It was published as Finansowy Kataklizm, Koniec Wieku Chciwości by the Jagiellonian University Press. And one on the networked protest in 2011, while it's kicking off everywhere. It was translated and published by Krytyka Polityczna as under the title Skąd ten bunt. And his 2015 last book, Post-Capitalism, as I think one of the most important contributions to the current debates on the effects of financial crisis and the role that digital technologies can play in building a post-capitalist societies. And he's working right now on the book Clear, Bright Future. And I think it's, as far as I know, it's about the defense of radical Marxist humanism in the age of algorithmic surveillance and new technologies, right? So I hope that we'll be able to hear maybe something from the upcoming book. Paul told me that it'll be published next year. Okay. And I could go on praising our guest, but I think it'll be best if I ask you to welcome Paul Mason wholeheartedly to us and give him the floor.
Well, thanks very much. My English is Northern English and it's fast, so I'll try and make it clearer and slower than normal. I caused a hurricane then, so we're here. So what I'm going to try and do is give you an outline of my current version of the theory that I outlined in the book Post-Capitalism, combined with some thinking that I've done since then and in the debates that have taken place around it. And it's very interesting. I mean, now I'm standing here in a museum doing the basic speech that I do about the book, and I've done it in some quite interesting places. I've been to major industries. I mean, literally, I was in Hamburg last month, and the first part of this presentation, for reasons you'll understand in a minute, was given to a room full of business people in Hamburg, sponsored by the biggest supermarket group in Germany. So at the same time, what I'm trying to do is to outline a new project for the left. It's very clear my version of this is a left thing. But let's get on and try and answer the question, will we be freed by machines? In the year 1603, Galileo wrote what I think is the most important contribution to answering this question. Galileo was surrounded, he writes in this book, De Mechanica, on mechanics, I'm surrounded by engineers who keep building machines that don't work. And the reason is they have an irrational belief that you can get more energy out of a machine than you put into it. In other words, the theorists, the contemporary scientific theorists who were his fellow professors in Padua, believed that machines defied nature. Now, Galileo proved in 30 pages of dense mathematics in this book that machines simply transform energy. They do not create extra energy. In other words, there is no mysterious force operating inside a machine. In 1767, Adam Smith performed the same basic logical achievement for economics. There's a Newcomen engine from the Adam Smith era, an early steam engine. And Smith was surrounded by business people who believed that machines were creating value. And that's why they wanted to make them. They made machines in order to expand value. And Smith says, in the classic outline of the labor theory of value, machines create no value. There's no economic mysterious force operating inside a machine. It's the labor that creates the value. And what a machine does is distribute the value into tiny pieces, into lots of products, in a way that a weaver or a fisherman or a blacksmith cannot do. So Smith says there's no mysterious force operating inside a machine. And all Marx really does is he perfects the theory. Marx's work is a critique of Smith and Ricardo. Today, we have to do the same thing. We have to demystify what's going on with machines. This machine is a Pentium 4 processor. Now, looking at this audience, it's actually possible that some of you were born after the Pentium 4 microprocessor was invented. But it was revolutionary at the time because it had 1 million switches on it. That's a machine with 1 million switches that don't move. That's all a silicon chip is. It's a machine with switches. And okay, well, what was so revolutionary about that? Your parents or your grandparents suddenly had computers that they could open 2 windows at once. They could multitasking could take place. Okay, in every one of your pockets is a cell phone with a machine on which there are 2 billion switches. So in this room, well, as there's 60 people in this room, we've probably got more switches than in the entire history of electrical switching before computers. Entirely possible. What do they produce? Well, most people think, well, information machines produce information, and they are right. But what we need to be able to understand is that there's no mystical thing going on here. In many ways, they're doing the same thing. They're transforming energy, as they did in Galileo's time, and they are expanding, as it were, the number of things into which economic value can be embodied. I would argue that the number one thing an information machine does, however, is to exponentially expand what Marx called use value, what you might call utility, usefulness. We could set my cell phone calculator going now, and it could calculate pi, the number pi, forever, all the way through this, through this lecture. It would be creating value, but it was use value. It's not necessarily creating economic value. But let me show you one of the effects of this kind of machine. This is the cost of sequencing DNA over the last 15 years. Now, the green line shows you the cost, and if anybody here is a mathematician, you'll be very interested in the fact that this scale is logarithmic. That is, the lines aren't equal. They're 10 times more than each one. Do you see what I mean? So up here is $100 million and down there is $1,000. And what's happened in 15 years is the cost of sequencing one entire genome of DNA has fallen exponentially from... So if this was an arithmetic scale, the graph would be as tall as the building. Yeah? Exponentially. And what's interesting, these graphs are produced regularly by the World Genome Council, whatever they're called, the National Human Genome Research Institute of America. Okay, there's Moore's Law. So Moore's Law is the idea that the number of switches on a chip doubles every 18 months. And that's true. That's so far, that's held good throughout the information era. But in 2007, genome sequencing just broke loose from Moore's Law. It's basically, in other words, the utility that computers and information science are providing in the era of genomics is developing much faster than the machines themselves are developing. Now, for me, this creates one of 4 fundamental effects of information technology. And all the way through this lecture, I'm going to try and refer to these 4 things and come back to them. This is something that's not there in the book because I've tried to get it right down so that business people and busy people can just get it into their brains and then challenge it, because some of this is challengeable. 4 things that information technology does. It disrupts the price mechanism. It delinks work from wages. It creates network effects, and it creates a systematic asymmetry of knowledge. And I'm going to go through them each one by one. Disrupting the price mechanism. This is the economist Paul Romer, who was in all other ways a mainstream economist, made this amazing conceptual breakthrough in 1990 in a paper known as Endogenous Technological Change, where Romer says, look, information is different because in 2 ways than all other commodities. It can be used without being degraded. Unlike a car park, it can, if I park my car in a space, you can't park your car in that space. Information can be used simultaneously by many people, and it's replicable forever. You can reproduce it effectively for close to zero. Now, since then, an economist called Jeremy Rifkin has summarized this effect as the zero marginal cost effect. And I think it's right. There's no mainstream economist has challenged this fundamentally new feature of information. That is, it replicates itself pretty endlessly, very cheaply. Of course, you're paying for the energy to run the chip. You're paying for mass and space. It takes up, a silicon chip takes up space in your pocket, but it has mass and energy, but it can produce a heck of a lot with that mass and energy. And the result is lots of things in society, lots of things in the economy have price curves that look like that. Now, the production cost is still real. If you're in a electronic dance music group, you still have to buy your instruments, you still have to take a hotel room to Florida, and you still have to buy some nice clothes, and that's good, but once you've made the electronic dance music, often using someone else's electronic dance music, which they've only just made themselves because you sampled it, once you've done that, unfortunately for you, your electronic dance music can be reproduced forever at no cost and is going to be pirated, and its cost of reproduction is going to follow that line, the green line on the old graph. So what do? You do something that capitalism has always done and always encouraged. You move to a higher value form of activity, which can't be instantly reproduced, which is live music. That's what's happened to the music industry in the last 15 years. Now, however, there's lots of examples of the disruptive effect of this on the price mechanism. And it's not just look, Deloitte, the consultancy, says that these effects are never going to stop. That unlike, say, the steel revolution or the chemical revolution or the industrial revolution itself, this doesn't stop and plateau out after 30 years. It carries on forever. The price of everything, or the cost of reproducing stuff, is going to fall. I'm not sure whether I agree with that, but they're a mainstream capitalist consultancy, and they say it. What I do think is we need to get our heads around its effect on the physical world. That's why I always use the genome and not the similar effect on, say, the cost of bandwidth, the cost of Wi-Fi, the cost of storage of information. These two are plummeting. Think about engineering. For the book, I interviewed some guys who designed a British-made fighter bomber called the Tornado in the 1970s. They used slide rules and electronic calculators, and they were able to calculate 12 different stress variables on the tail fin of this fighter. And the same guys at the end of their career designed its replacement, which is the Typhoon, the Eurofighter. And they did the same calculation 186 million times simultaneously. So they flew the aircraft virtually on a supercomputer linked between China, the UK, and somewhere else, I can't remember, 186 million times until they worked out that it wasn't going to fail, and then they put the first screw into the first piece of metal. That's a very different process. That's an information-led process, but it's a physical process. And what's the result? The result is that from prototype to the end one they make flawless engineering outputs, which we've never been able to do. So I'm excited by this. You should be excited by it. But capitalism should be worried about it, because what's it doing? It is disrupting the price mechanism. It's disrupting something which I'll come to, one of the normal responses of capitalism to technical innovation. Delinking work from wages is a no-brainer. Some of you will have worked on the way here. You'll be effectively working now. You can look at your phone, answer an email. At work, there are leisure activities. Some of us do a lot of organizing our holidays, our personal lives, our Tinder and Grindr and the rest of it at work. It's normal. It's not just here in the space of middle-class work. In China, I've interviewed factory workers whose proudest possession is their cell phone, and of course they are rigidly regimented on the shop floor. But in every break, or the same you could see outside, say, hotels or big restaurants here. You'll see guys and women standing outside having their cigarette. The cigarette's just an excuse to be on the phone. The work and leisure are being merged together, and the result is, my dad's generation worked hour by hour. They clocked into a workplace with a machine. They clock the card. I'm in, and at the end, I get paid some money for how many hours between coming in and coming out. Many of us just don't work like that anymore. But at the same time, one of the side effects of this we'll come to is that at the low level, capitalists have become very obsessed with physically what we do at work, which we'll come back to. The network effects, economists call these positive externalities, but let's call them network effects. That is, if we all have a conversation about this lecture now, and we do it online, if we put the phones in our pockets and don't get them out, and just have a conversation, we enrich each other's minds, and that's it. If we did it online and we tweet about it and we respond to it, we're creating a cloud of information that is bigger than us. And this is free. This is free utility. If we wanted to share it all out among ourselves, it would be very useful to us. What did that guy say about that point Paul made? Fine. That's what it does. It creates free utility on a vast scale. And finally, this systematic asymmetry of knowledge. Now, you might think, well, what's the problem with that? That's obvious that, Mark Zuckerberg knows more about me, controls indeed the algorithm that I rely on to communicate, and I don't even know what's in the box. I don't know what he knows, and I'm not allowed to. In fact, the suggestion that I should be allowed to know is as heretical as Galileo's suggestion about the world not being the center of the universe. But economics finds this very unusual because mainstream economics for 200 years has insisted that asymmetries of information, that is, like cartels or trade unions or monopolies, always get eroded by the market. The natural thing for power asymmetries is, says market theory, that they disappear. But this is not disappearing. Now, what's this doing to capitalism? I define capitalism as a complex adaptive system. I categorize it, I should say, as a complex adaptive system. It's always survived through mutation, big mutation so big that people say this can't be capitalism. It survives by replacing essentially low-value work with high-value activity. So the EDM band stops relying on their recordings and they move to the theatre, to big festivals, or to the open air, and they charge a lot of money to go and see them. But the problem is, information is limiting capitalism's ability to do that. And the other thing that capitalism has always done is to colonize the non-market space. And there's a great example of this. Rosa Luxemburg, in her book, The Accumulation of Capital, which predicted that capitalism would collapse because it would run out of colonial markets, said, when there's all the markets, all the non-capitalist parts of the world have been colonized by capital, then it'll collapse. In the time it took her to write The Accumulation of Capital, but the number of movie theaters in Berlin where she was working went from 1 to 163 in 2 years. Now, that's not 1914, that's 1927. But you can see social progress there and the colonization of non-market space. Because what happened is that workers' leisure time and middle-class people's leisure time was now colonized by a new industry, the movie theater. And the number of workers who work in one of them is low compared to, say, a vaudeville theater, the pre-1914 theatre, which had a crew that looked like a ship. You just need a person on the projection, somebody on the door, and 3 usherettes with torches to get people in and out, person selling nuts. It's really a great example of what classic Marxism missed, the ability of capitalism to colonize every piece of space between you. Great example now is friendship. 30 years ago, if you said there will be the biggest company in the world, or one of the biggest companies, is selling friendship, people would have just thought you were nuts. But capitalism has always relied on this ability to colonize non-market space with markets. Now, my argument is that these 4 spontaneous actions that capitalism has taken, as information capitalism has produced, also then produce reactions. And here's how it goes. In other words, information capitalism as it exists now is a response to the technology, but it doesn't quite work. So the first thing that happens when prices are naturally going to follow this exponential downward curve, is you create monopolies. And what's happened in the last 15 years is the creation of single sector monopolies on a scale we've never ever seen in the history of the system. Not in Japan in the 1890s, not in Germany in the era of Krupp and Thyssen. You've never seen the level of monopolization that we've got now. Facebook, Google, Amazon, and eBay are not competitors. They overlap in some tiny spaces. They are single sector monopolies. And what's their purpose? To maintain price in an era when it's supposed to fall. So the classic example is the 99 cents a track iTunes model. That's 99 cents whether it's a good song or a bad song, whether the demand is up or down, however much the song costs, whether it's a symphony orchestra or one guy with a banjo, it's always 99 cents because the price has no relationship to supply, demand or quality. It's just what Apple decided was a good price point for music, whose real cost of production is close to zero. Does it survive? Of course, no, it doesn't, because then you have to move to $9.99 a month to listen to all music, and then that gets eroded. In fact, there's a great example that somebody calculated that if you had to live off selling music on iTunes, you could make the minimum wage in America by selling 1,200 tracks a month. But on Spotify, you have to sell 1 million. You have to have 1 million listens a month. So you can see that even the reaction, the monopolization, only lasts a certain amount of time. Now, this is the really interesting thing when we come to work. The potential obviously exists for rapid and vast automation. I think it's true, the Oxford Internet Institute in 2013, and the landmark piece of research said that about 47% of all jobs are going to be automated over the next 30 or 40 years. But are we automating 30 or 40% of all jobs? No, we're not. What we're doing is creating millions of jobs that don't need to exist. These are what the anthropologist David Graeber calls bullshit jobs. A great example of them, in Britain, 20 years ago, we had 4,000 automated car washes, and if somebody washed your car by hand, it was going to be a Rolls Royce. That was a kind of don't scratch it type washing. We now have 1,000 automated car washes, so 3,000 have been scrapped and closed down. And instead, we have 20,000 hand car washes, all staffed mainly by migrants, and some of them by trafficked people, like slaves. In an era of technological advance like we've never seen, we're creating semi-slave labor, because that's the only thing they can think to do to respond, to keep the system going. When it comes to the network effect, the response is obvious. What we get is the creation of rent-seeking business models. Now, rent-seeking in economic terms is when, instead of trying to create value through innovation, you simply, I stand at the door there and I say, you're not going to pass this door unless you pay me some money. I own the door. You have to rent your way through it. That's rent-seeking. Who are the rent seekers? Facebook, Google, Amazon, Uber, Airbnb. Some of them not even technology companies. They just decided that they were going to monopolize the network effects for themselves and prevent the emergence of free, collaborative, shared use of this network positivity and monopolize it from the get-go. Finally, what's capitalism's response to the huge asymmetry of information? Well, Milton Friedman or Hayek would say we should pass laws against it. What capitalism has done is pass laws that make it permanent. I did some work for a Hollywood studio, and I got a contract saying that they had the right to use my work for all time and forever, everywhere in the universe. So even when the planet has blown up and it's drifting through space as dust, my advisory work on the movie Jason Bourne will still be owned by Universal Studios. But you laugh, but this is how new the information effects are. So what do we need to do? Information capitalism, I argue, therefore, is dysfunctional. And it's going to get more and more dysfunctional. In fact, I'll talk in a minute about what I think it looks like if it fails completely. But we have to conceive the economy in 4 silos or buckets or just 4 categories: work, machines, materials, and energy. In other words, this is already post-economic, because economics cares nothing for these categories in a way. The labour market economics is one of the most boring subjects you can ever study. Economists don't care what machines do. Materials are throughput. Energy is a cost. The post-capitalism project takes each of those categories and asks a simple question: how do we use the information effects, the 4 effects, price disruption, automation, network effects, and information asymmetry. What do we do about them in ways that makes one very simple thing happen? Each one of these, the cost of producing them has to fall. Because if we can make the cost of producing each one of these fall, rather than artificially keeping it high, we can move from scarcity to abundance. This has been the basis of all utopian thinking since Aristotle and Jesus Christ. A society in which private property and scarcity does not run is a nice society. And another way of explaining my post-capitalism thesis is that information technology kind of makes utopian socialism possible. How? In the face of monopolies that have seized the high ground and are artificially maintaining high cost and high price, what you need to do is to promote non-market production of goods and services. And specifically what you can do with the companies themselves is break them up. If there were 10 Facebooks competing with each other, the ability to scrape billions of profit out of our activity would not really be there. And in fact, if one of them was commonly or cooperatively or publicly owned, it would be very interesting because it could say, we're going to provide Facebook without advertising. How do you like that? Do you think Facebook would, as it currently exists, would survive? No. So if you promote the non-market production of some goods and services, it changes the game. Promote rapid automation. So I am a pro-automation. I like the idea that machines do things that I don't now have to do. I can concentrate on doing something else. Marx, in that amazing prescient late-night notebook, the Grundrisse, the Fragment on Machines, talks about the utopian socialists said, look, we want work to be like as good as play. They said work should be enjoyable. Marx said, it can't become like play. What's going to happen to it as we automate? It's going to disappear. Better that it disappears, and then you can play all day. As he's famously said, you can hunt in the morning, shoot in the afternoon, fish in the evening. I think Marx had this thing about animals, actually. But for him, freedom seemed to be killing a lot of animals. But you can see what he meant. You could do things that weren't needed. You could do them because you like doing them. Against the rent seekers, very simple. Legislate. I would make it illegal to set up a rent-seeking business. And certainly, you can imagine the European Union actually saying, look, there's no need to have business models that are based on scraping extra value out of productive activity in the form of basically, we have this word in English, the highwayman, the robber in the mask with the pistol in the 18th century. That's what these companies are. And you don't have to imagine it because this is happening. Barcelona has basically tried to ban Uber. It's declared war on Airbnb. Put your apartment on Airbnb in Berlin, there's a €100,000 fine. It's people finally getting the idea that these companies aren't necessarily needed and that you could just as easily have a wiki-type solution or a publicly owned city-owned solution to Uber. As regards information asymmetry, there's a simple thing. You can't abolish IP. You can't abolish intellectual property, but you can restrict it to the innovation phase. If you've ever bought one of my books, I'm absolutely certain there's lots of them sitting in second-hand shops for a euro. Yeah, why shouldn't that happen to my digital information? Why shouldn't the copyright be short? And why shouldn't my reward be good at the beginning and non-existent afterwards? After all, did the Beatles make their early records so that they could be charged 99 cents a track for them today? No, they did it because they wanted to smoke drugs and meet pretty-looking women and all the rest of it. Why do rock bands do things? Their motivation was reward now, and the whole of Hollywood and the music industry and the digital information industry has basically tried to extend IP forever. We should restrict it. Now I'm going to switch to talking about agency. This is the bit I didn't do. for the Otto Group supermarket magnates in Hamburg. Because what I've just described to you is a transition path beyond capitalism. It's a long one, so it's not like the Marxist one where you seize power and then execute a rapid forced march to a planned economy. There's no need for that. And in fact, in the book, I have a whole chapter devoted to an argument with some very obscure but very interesting people. That is the cyber communists, the people who want to reenact planned economy using supercomputers. And I show why I think it's a dead end. Don't dream about doing it, because to do it, you have to kill all change. You have to make everything predictable. And they accept that. Everybody would have to work forever in one firm. It's not going to happen. Let's move. I think we can do a route one move to abundance in about the space of about a century, using infotech, and also, of course, taking into account the problems of the environment and the demographic issues that are related to this transition. And what we need to do is take control of technology and do what Adam Smith's generation did. They said, look, there's a technology, the factory, the machine, the modern city that seems to work. Let's understand where it's going, understand its limits, and regulate it in such a way that it produces well-being, not crazy, chaotic outcomes. But if I'm describing a transition beyond capitalism, I think we then have to ask who wants it, who can do it. Now, I'm doing this bit especially for you because I know that in the seminar tomorrow that we're doing, and in some of the discussions you've had, that was outlined at the introduction, there is an interest in the future of labour, the future of work, the future of workers and workers' movements. So this is a brief history of agency. This is my hometown, Manchester, in 1819. Marx was only 1 year old. Nothing to do with Marx, okay? That's the working class. The people on the platform are Democrats asking for a democratic parliament, and the people on the horses are the cavalry cutting them down. There were 21 people killed and 400 people injured by sword slashes. It's called the Peterloo Massacre because the troops had just come from Waterloo. So that's the working class. And who were they? Relatively educated. They wanted a social republic, and they had clubs where they educated themselves to be able to be consistent Democrats and educated voters. That was their understanding of how change would happen. 1888, the first mass strikes happen in Britain of unskilled workers, uneducated workers. These are the so-called match girls who went on strike in the first unskilled strike, a non-union, organised by feminists, organised, these are, in case you can't tell, that is what a very poor person looks like in England in 1888. And then the year later, the whole of London erupted in a general strike of dock workers who were supposed to be equally ignorant and uneducated. So the mass workers movement we now see, not the educated elite, and not just men. This is America 1936, the sit-down strikes. This one happens to be in Woolworths, which was a big supermarket, a big department store. But I've chosen it because I think by then, it was clear that, the Marxist dream that workers wanted socialism and communism was clearly disproven by practice. Most Marxists were sitting around going, why don't the workers want communism or whatever? But what they did want was control at work. And I think that the agency we see at work here in the mid-20th century is all about extending control. And after the workers discover mass culture, and the Frankfurt School discovered that they don't like workers who have discovered mass culture, and the Frankfurt School gives up on the idea that workers are agents. Other people have to be found to be the agents of change. Here's the Sandinistas when they took power in 1980. But it could be, I could have shown you the Black Panthers, I could have shown you any of the other movements that from Herbert Marcuse onwards in 1960, right the way through to when I got involved in politics in the early 80s. There was basically the idea that somebody has to be the agent of change, and if it's not the proletariat, it's got to be somebody else. Here's Gezi Park Taksim Square in 2013. I covered that protest, and it was one I wrote about in the second edition of my book, Why It's Kicking Off Everywhere, the Skatem Bun, however you say it. And in that book, I said, look, there is a new agent of change, and it's the networked individual. The networked individual had been discovered by sociologists like Richard Sennett, the Anglo-American sociologist, when he was studying tech workforces. And he said, look, these people have weak ties with each other. They cultivate mercuriality. They live in big cities. They like networking at night with each other. They accept a lot of precariousness in return for what they see as a kind of freedom from hierarchy. But by 2013, tens of thousands of such people were just all sitting on the grass in Taksim Square. Now, they weren't just middle class and techies. They were football fans. The most moving part of this was when the football fans started swapping shirts with each other. The Turkish football fans kill each other in a ritually organised gang fights. And when they all stood together and took their shirts off and swapped them with the rival team, that was just a moment. Now, what I've been asking myself is, what would it take for the networked individual to be able to enact this thing I want to do, which is to transform the economy slowly in a controlled, tested and challengeable way from the disaster that I think is going to produce now into something that we can sustain. And I've been thinking about this dichotomy that is well known from Marx. Some of you might have grown up under the communist era here, and you might have read all these textbooks. Classic orthodox Marxism thinks, Marx said, the working class as agents, so these guys, needs to move from a class in itself to a class for itself. What he actually said is it needs to stop being a class defined in relation to capital and become a class for itself. And he always said that means politically. Now, I think this is that's a good question. I'm looking at this audience, I'm thinking there's lots of networked individuals, the people who conceive of their lives in a networked economy, as their oppression as multiple. That is, you're a woman, you're gay, you're working class, you're from an ethnic minority. There's not a single binary form of oppression anymore. And you understand how to maneuver, and implicitly you understand how to, organize stuff. I'm betting with a lot of the people in this audience. But how do you go from that to all the people in these craft beer bars and working in Starbucks, understanding that they have something in common that they need to achieve rather than something that they need to simply resist? That's really what a modern version of Marx would ask. And the interesting thing is that some Marxists did ask it. This is a picture of almost a pre-industrial resistance struggle. It's London in 1880. It's the so-called Gordon riots. Now, the form that resistance took here was to simply go to the main prison and let everybody out, because it was perceived that the elite, the main way they oppressed people was just throwing working class people, or poor people, urban poor, into prison. And therefore, that's a sort of 200 years plus version of Taksim Square in Gezi Park, or Occupy. That it's a different kind of struggle. And one of my intellectual heroes is Edward Thompson, E.P. Thompson, who wrote against the orthodox Stalinist Marx. Now, he was a Communist Party member. He left in 1956 over Hungary, but he fought all his life against the orthodox Marxism of orthodox communist parties. And he said, look, class is not about workers v bosses. It's defined by people as they live their own history, and that's the only definition of it. And what he was specifically referring to was basically orthodox Marxism said of the 18th century, there was no class struggle because there was no proletariat. And Thompson was really saying, well, what is this then? What is a prison riot if it's not some kind of a class struggle? Now, if there's any among you who are like me, an atheist, you'll be aware of this idea that Marcus Aurelius once said, look, once upon a time, I didn't exist. In the future, I won't exist, and I don't mind. This is the famous atheist aphorism of Marcus Aurelius. And I think this kind of, for me, also applies to the proletariat. Once it didn't exist, soon it will be so unrecognizable that you probably say it doesn't exist in the same form as it always has. I don't mind. As long as there is an agent of change to resist that embodies some values that are positive values. And in a way, we are a lot more like the 18th century urban mass than we are the 19th century proletariat. That doesn't stop us changing the world. This is what Thompson was trying to say. You can't just read everything through the classic 19th century. And so, what I think is going to happen is, if you look at some examples of, for me, the sequence of, the big sequence of protests since 2011 has been this. 2010, 2011, the student riots, the Occupy, the anti-austerity movements in Greece take off. The idea of seizing space in squares, and as Manuel Castells says, the Catalan sociologist, people invented a new society on the internet, and then they took it into reality on the streets. That's ground zero for the kind of change I think needs to happen. Then everybody said, well, that was just the elite of some developed countries. And then the Brazilians did it. And then in their own way, with all its problems, the Ukraine, the Maidan did it. And then the Turks did it. And people realized this wasn't something that just happened in high value societies. There are networked individuals, and they protest more or less in the same way in lots of places. And we should have known that because of Egypt, in a way. Then you get Black Lives Matter. And Black Lives Matter is, to me, a really important thing that we should study for more than just its amazing heroism. Because what it was educated black young people it's not like they're reenacting the civil rights movement. They've got PhDs in studying the civil rights movement, and yet they're still being shot, for getting out of a car, while being black by police. And in other words, it's an incredible testimony to the power of network communication and education. And Black Lives Matter is the thing that I think then the thing that trumps it, and I know it's not so big here, but it's huge in the English-speaking world, is Me Too, the Me Too movement against sexual harassment in the workplace. Me Too's gone to China in the last 3 weeks. Chinese women have started to demand equality in hiring. That Chinese firms advertise, come and work here, there are pretty women. So they've started to say no. And for simply doing that, they've now had to evade censorship, surveillance, crackdown. They're using blockchain to organize between them a Me Too movement in China. Now, Me Too, in other words, shows something that I've used this as the last slide, that is just that Brecht kind of understood. But you see, Brecht's not so fashionable now in the theatre, certainly not in the English theatre, but he's fashionable in Paul Mason's house because he's misunderstood. Lots of people think Brecht's all about kind of communist people in mouse suits marching around going on about the proletariat, but very few of Brecht's plays are about the proletariat. They're about ordinary people. And his only film, Kula Vampa, is about a youth group, a communist youth group in Berlin the year before Hitler takes power. And the final scene, the hero is the guy with the upturned face and his girlfriend standing behind him with a very amazing modern-looking blonde haircut. And they say, there's an argument in an underground train, and it goes on for a long time. It lasts about 20 minutes. And it's everybody in German society saying to these youth, you can't change the world. It's never going to change. It's like it is. And they go through, why not? Why not? Well, because. And the final line is, she says, I'll tell you who's going to change the world, those who don't like it. And to me, that is what I think the form of agency that I cling on to, because this form of capitalism that I've described, monopolized, surveillance, total asymmetry of power between you, Zuckerberg, Sergey Brin and Larry, who run Google. Total asymmetry of power between you and the coming giants of the AI industry and the Chinese government, which has monopolized its own AI industry. Total, as it were, advanced ownership of everything you produce in your mind by somebody else. It's you against them. And it will manifest in many ways. There's a great line in this book, in this small book called The Coming Insurrection, which was produced by French anarchists in 2007, where they say the proletariat only had the factory to find each other in. We have the whole of society. We're exploited when we shop, when we create a brand, when we wear sneakers, when we make friends with each other on Facebook or Tinder, or we use Instagram or whatever, on a dating site. Everything about our lives is valorizing capital, and we can still define ourselves, as Marx said, against capital, but in defining what we are for, we don't march along in the serried, uniform, hierarchical male ranks of the communist, propaganda movie. We're all individuals, and what we're fighting for is our individuality and our ability to express it freely using the leisure time that a technological future can unleash. Now, that's the end of my lecture, but there's lots of hanging questions like, well, what specifically do we need to do? What policy? How do we need to organize? And so, we can discuss them, or you can just talk about what I've said. Thank you.
So Paul asked some questions, and we can start with the questions he pointed to at the end of his lecture. But it's now up to you. You have the floor, you have the voice, and I will gather 2 to 3 questions in each row, and then Paul will answer them. I see 1, 2, and 3. Okay, let's start with you 3.
Thanks. Yeah, I think that the way you diagnose capitalism basically is like the mix of some very basic Marxism and mixed with monopolistic capital theory and some operaismo as well. So that's pretty much like a fashionable mix, which is, I think, very attractive theoretically and also has some implications towards it produces like very useful narrative to deal with certain problems, but getting to the more economics-based level, I firmly doubt, or rather, I'll turn into question, what makes you think that those, whatever you call it, those non-markets producing some, I don't know, tools of production, something, entities that produce, basically. So what makes you think that in the current model, under the neoliberal dynamics, like the mass flourishing of those entities is really possible, and what makes you think that mechanisms of making them, even if they're born, tempted to simply sell out to like the big monopolistic entities, what makes you think that it's possible? I mean, not to have it, because I mean, as far as I can tell, this is what I mean. They've got tools for that. They've got tools that make those entities tempted to not to resist, but to sell out. Right? This is what the whole ideology of so-called startups is based on. Right? So my question is, suppose that.
So I guess that question is going to be a lot later to go on. And my question is, you talked about how infocapitalism brought on this reality that makes this utopian socialism possible, right? So if it got us to this point, don't you think it's worth seeing if it can get us further? Because that's what got us here. So that's already good, can be better. Why shouldn't we just let it be?
Do you think about these bullshit jobs? Do you think the state should take some active position aimed specifically at eliminating them and what that could be specifically, and kind of connected with that about this rent-seeking business and banning them. You said some countries are succeeding, but they succeeded in banning them. But in fact, to ban Uber and what takes over are the traditional big corporate taxis. You ban R&B and the big corporate hotel chains. We know our customer has to pay more and there's less choice. So how to actually fix it?
So thank you for all those questions. And I'll try. Let me go to your one first about if it's done so much good, why not just keep it going? Okay. Well, the problem is, I think the tech economy is not divorced from the actual big financial real economy. And in many ways, I think the big tech companies know that their model is in many ways unsustainable. The number one company that has almost given Karl Marx a birthday present, 200th birthday present, that has done this is Facebook. Facebook know that the future for them is 50-50. It's 50-50 whether they'll exist. Instagram and WhatsApp, fine, but because that's where your generation is migrated to anyway. But WhatsApp is encrypted. That in the sense that that there's a very different form of valorization coming out of WhatsApp. Go on. Yeah, it's still no. I'm saying, but it's a very different business model to let's scrape everybody's data for free and monopolize our knowledge of them over them. Mark Zuckerberg can't see what I'm WhatsApping to other people. Okay, no. The capitalism you live in, all right, Poland's, you live in somewhere that's flourished as a part of the result of the European Union, part of the result of regional factors, partly the result of the maturing of a transition to capitalism. Okay. But my country, the oldest capitalist country, is just dying on its feet. Its entire growth is supported by quantitative easing. What does an entrepreneur in Britain sets up a security company and employs you guys, or a cleaning company? That's what an entrepreneur means. I.e., there's no incentive to innovate and to automate. So the shitty sort of grubby, low-paid capitalism is the price you pay for the fact that the tech part of the economy can't replace classic capitalism. No, what I say in the book is, again, the classic Marxists of you will hopefully get the irony of this. Lenin in 1921 had to reintroduce capitalism to Russia because war communism was so chaotic. They said, we need private ownership, the market, we need farmers, the kulaks, enrich yourselves. No, the thing is, in a way, my fear is we actually might have to do that. As the failures stack up of present day capitalism, and I'll go through why it's going to take a while for it to fall, that I want us to proactively say, like, the state needs to incentivize in every country. Part of the left's program needs to be, in fact, a space in which innovative, really technologically innovative companies can work. I'll come to the practicalities of it as well, because my answer to kind of both of you, I'll come to your specific question in a minute, but my general answer is that for about 20 years, people who believe, as I do, that the kind of wiki economy, the collaborative peer-to-peer economy can work, have wasted a lot of time trying to build it at a small-scale level instead of thinking about socially transformative demands and projects. Because if you look at what happened to the factory system in between 1780 and 1820 in Britain was like teetering on the edge of failure all the time. And they kept saying, look, we can only keep this going with child labor. It's never going to work if it's only adults. And the state said to them, no, factories are amazingly productive. If we stop you polluting your local river and working people to death and whipping them and all the rest of it and employing 4-year-old children, it could work better. In other words, the state regulated the early technology of capitalism and made it mature. And what I would argue is that we're now approaching a moment in the tech economy where the state needs to do that. Now, it's like saying this to a Silicon Valley people is like saying, it's like this. It's really like a cost to a Dracula. It's like, but it was it was to the child labour employers of 19th century Britain. And I think that my project, why I call myself a radical social democrat, I don't think this is just owned by social democrats. It can be a project for the left. For many Green parties are already understanding it. Is you say to the state, right, nurture the tech economy, nurture the collaborative part of the economy, nurture it and regulate in a way that prevents the rent seeking and monopoly. Now, coming to your question about that's so. Yeah, absolutely. If all you do is stop them, then all you do is you return the power of the old, the mafia-controlled minicab firms, the hotels that where, like this Soviet era one where I'm staying right now, is a kind of hotels like that, right? Okay, I won't name it, but it's not that bad, but I think it's not really competing with anybody. I think that's his problem. So yeah, in other words, you need an intellectual framework for the regulation. You see, well, what we're trying to do is certain sectors can operate in a wiki-style way. And it doesn't have to then again be rocket science. In Athens, there's a really good, and it predated Uber, a really good minicab firm, minicab or app called TaxiBeat. And the advantages are the same ones as Uber. You get a face, you don't get an anonymous person, you get to rate them. It always comes. And the guys who don't want to be part of it, which is the old mafia-controlled taxi business, they're just dying. No, there's nothing to stop. London has a court case that will last for years that ultimately could ban Uber from London. And there's nothing to stop London, the city of London, with 9 million people, just designing its own application where people, because it regulates the cabs anyway. The actual Uber model, which is anybody can turn up in a car and say they're an Uber driver and pick you up, which is they applied in America, doesn't work in a European space, and it doesn't work in any really regulated European city. Certainly, they had to apply to become a minicab company in order to operate. But I think Uber ultimately is not about the minicabs. It's about self-driving cars. It's a bet by the Saudi billionaires who funded it that they can force cities in 50 years' time to have micro-charging systems between every car and every vehicle, and that the transport system of, say, Warsaw will be regulated by a continually active micro-payment system. If I want to go in the fast lane, I pay a bit extra than you in the slow lane, because the alternative to it is one big AI sitting in the city hall running a city transport system for free. And that's, in other words, I think we face these binary choices in the future that I want us to try and think of alternatives to Silicon Valley versus old-style mafia capitalism. There is a third choice. And with regard to your, you've got it right. I mean, my attempt is not a mixture, but it's an attempt to synthesize in a way that I hope is coherent. An idea based on the labour theory of value. Because what I think we can use the labour theory of value for is what it was originally used, but in a much more exciting way. If we're going to move to a situation where some of the activity I do is work and some is not work, and that both my work and my not work are actually valorizing capital. So my consumption, my leisure is valorizing capital somewhere, but I want to lessen the part of the economy that is capital and increase the part of the economy that is the non-market, that is just life, as it were. I need a measure that can measure both things. Classical economics can't do it, because for classical economics, the reaction against the labour theory of value in the 1870s said everything is economic that is scarce. Everything that is economic that involves a monetary transaction. If we go down to here and play chess with each other, that cannot be economic. Economics has no way of measuring useful activity. It only has ways of measuring that which can be marketized. And if I'm right, less and less of human activity will be in the market. More and more of it will be leisure time or play. And you just need a way of calculating. And again, while they reject the idea of post-capitalism, many governments are right now trying to work out new ways of measuring economic activity beyond GDP, because they understand that what they're looking for, if they only knew it, they're looking for a definition of exchange value and use value that exists in classic political economy from Smith to Marx and Ricardo, but they abandoned in the 1870s. They're looking for a measure of human activity that isn't money, and they're right to look for it, but they need to keep searching until they find the right one.
Okay. Are there any more questions? Yeah. You can throw something at us if you want.
Yeah, maybe your Northern English was too quick, so I missed something. But I'm happy that you still have this picture on the table, because that Goethe says those who are not satisfied, a year later, those who were not satisfied turned to the right wing. And how do you know? How do you know that it doesn't turn to the right wing? Because what's going on now, I think, in Europe is exactly this. This machinery, which should free us, is controlling us more and more. This is a tendency. So we are more and more going in direction of a control of a controlling us state. So in England, you have, I don't know how many million of cameras you have, which you sell to the people which are necessary. And I'm well, in a way, they maybe they are necessary, but on the other hand, it is more control. So what makes me a little bit not happy is that it seems that you cannot leave this idea of profit-making capitalism, as you say. People who are going more on the one side, they use their leisure time, they are working their leisure time, but on the other hand, they are still working for the profit-making market. So I think that's a problem of what you called, even of a radical social democrat. But I think it is a problem of the social democracy. So a lot of questions.
Well, let me just answer briefly then. You there. I am very worried about the right in all its forms, but the most consistent form and the form I think we understand less, because you have the fascists here in Poland, we've got fascists in England, is the alt-right in America. Because in 2009, straight after the economic crisis, Peter Thiel, who founded PayPal, no, he's not alt-right, they call him alt-light, but I'll explain the difference. Peter Thiel, millionaire, wrote, because of this crisis, freedom and democracy are not compatible. Now, what he means is economic freedom. That's how the right conceives freedom. My economic freedom is no longer compatible, he says, because it causes so much catastrophe and crisis that a rational person is going to vote against it. Therefore, what do? Well, their original idea was to colonize space, build islands, and create a separate economy on the internet. That was what the alt-right began to do. But what they actually then discovered is that they could also recreate a right-wing society on the internet. What is their obsession? What are their obsessions? Racial science, which proves that people of color are inferior. That's the number one obsession. Number two obsession, women. Liberated women oppress men. You'll find this guy who mowed down 10 people in Toronto is what they call incel, involuntary celibate. It's everywhere. Young guys are being recruited to this, to hate women, basically, to say that a woman liberated, sexually free, is oppressing men because the hierarchy should go strong men, weak men, women, and it's been changed to strong men, women, weak men. And this movement is big, and it's full of teenage boys who want to pick up a gun and shoot people. So the new form of right-wing, on top of racism and sexism and homophobia and anti-Semitism, is this. Now, I'm not convinced that we're going to win, because I'm not convinced that, at least in every country, that we are building strong enough radical progressive movements to resist them. But I know on what basis the resistance will be. Because, Luke, It can't include black people. It can't include the liberated woman. If you watch some of these, there's been a few documentaries about fascist women, actually. There's a documentary about the Greek fascist women, and the other countries. It's become a meme. The women of the far right, and it's often women who want to play a stereotypically female role, but that means it's excluded for most other people. So we can build a movement. These things that appeared, say, to the Frankfurt School as like ephemeral but good, like women's rights, gay rights, black civil rights movement. I think that is the movement. Of course, the movement for freedom at work, the freedom from exploitation and precarity. But the movement will feel far more like a rainbow than the old proletarian one. But that's good because it can be stronger. Ultimately, I think the decisive question, as in the 1930s, is what does the elite do? And how does the elite conceive what the danger is? The tragedy right now all over Europe is that the centrist liberal elite still believes that the left is the main problem. It's just as in the 30s. The reason why Germany went fascist isn't necessarily because lots of people swung, but because the last three chancellors of Germany before Hitler actually created an authoritarian state. They thought they were defending democracy against the left, so they created the police forces that would batter workers, heavy, police state. And it was a machine for fascism to take over. Now, I think there is a huge danger in Europe and America, even now, that if you ask Hillary Clinton what the main problem is, it's Bernie Sanders. And if you ask, the British business class who they fear most, it's the Labour Party. Okay, so we need to. But my argument is, I want to have an argument with them, and I want to. I met the guy who used to be Goldman Sachs' chief economist, and we did a radio program together. And I said to him, Luke, this always causes absolute outrage from some left people against what's coming, against Marine Le Pen, against Viktor Orban, and against the AfD in Germany. I will unite with you in a popular front 1930s style if you want to be in it. And he was a good guy, and he said, yes, you're right. But that has big compromise problems as well, doesn't it? Because it means voting for Macron against Le Pen. And then what does Macron do? He turns around and attacks the left. But that's the world we're in. It's very similar to the world of our grandfathers, I'm afraid. But what the elite does is crucial. And I think some parts of that Silicon Valley elite are gone totally right-wing, but other parts of it are kind of getting it, that the capitalism as it exists today can't thrive, and we need alternatives. Do you want to ask me another question? I will allow you, because you.
But do you really think that it's the elite whom you will convince that they are turning? I miss the political point of your argument, because you say maybe I have the feeling that the machines themselves, they will do the work. No, they wouldn't. We have to do the work. But what shall we do? Why is the story is going right in the other direction?
Okay, let me think about that and come back to you. Let's have another question. Let me think now.
Just wanted to go back to the concept of automation and possibly taking jobs from the working class and people. A school of thought that's emerging is to do with universal basic income, and the Swiss rejected it by referendum. The Finns are trying it. Just wanted to curious to know what your thoughts are on that concept and how it will progress.
So I do advocate the universal basic income, but I also think that a step towards it is what we call universal basic services. Because if you think about these four silos I created, work, machines, energy, and materials, making work cheaper to produce, I see workers cheaper to produce, it's really a no-brainer to provide. See, when trade union activists go to, say, Uber drivers or very low-paid cleaners in Britain and say, we're going to fight for a 5% pay increase, what they always say is, that's not so interesting to us. But what if we could get cheap housing, cheap transport, cheap education, our lives would be transformed. And so I think the idea, obviously very unpopular in some post-communist countries, of the state providing a basic guaranteed form of living. So everybody gets a house on a cheap rent. Everybody gets cheap or free transport, because once you've built a metro system, it's a sunk cost. You don't need to make loads of profits from it. That would transform the lives of most young people in the Northern Hemisphere. The basic income is harder to do because you have to model it. And what you have to model is the behavioral outcome. Any idea that these trials in Finland and Utrecht are any use whatsoever, to me, is an overestimation. We need mass modeling of it. So we need a supercomputer and a network, and we need the data from Facebook. 14 million people, a country the size of how many people in Poland? 40 million. We need a country the size of Poland to a virtual country and run it for 50 years, with 40 million virtual people on a supercomputer, and then work out the pros and cons of it. But in the meantime, you can do universal basic services if you're prepared to tax. The point about these companies as well is that none of them have business models that can survive taxation. It's not like I'm not paying my tax, I've moved to Luxembourg, I've moved to Ireland. If they paid tax for real, they couldn't be giving away all the information, and it just wouldn't work. So in a way, there's trillions of dollars worth of tax sitting in tax havens. I think it's $6 trillion is sitting in tax havens, waiting to be invested. It's the ultimate birthday present to Karl Marx. It is $6 trillion worth of capital that cannot be productively invested, because to do so, it will have to pass through the portal of the tax system and allow us to build. If you just imagine what the tax take of a country like Poland would be if it actually did have a functioning welfare state, you could have libraries and this kind of place could be a facility in every small town. You could really invest a lot of money. And how do we know that? Because where there is money in the capitalist system, like in some of the advanced, like in Sweden, like in some smaller advanced countries, life can be pretty good. It's just that it can't provide it for everybody. So the answer is basic income, but trial it and model it. In the meantime, basic services paid for by taxation. And for me, that's the program of the radical social democracy. Is people say, why are you so, do you want to bring the state back to run the railway system? Well, look, they will hand the railway system back to the state if they have to pay tax, pay decent wages, and charge people fares that are affordable. I travelled on a Polish train, and I have to say it was an affordable fare, but it was a Second World War era train, so there was a pros and cons between that. Who else wants to?
Yep. I will maybe use this opportunity because there's one issue I wanted to ask you, or a bit challenge you, from a non-orthodox Marxist perspective, about the subject of change, how to find it. I think that just saying a network individuality is a little bit too little to define or to find this subject. And well, the classical Marxist perspective would say you find it in the economic contradictions of the system. This is how proletariat was once, let's say, diagnosed and found. And we don't have to look for proletariat, we have to look for a subject that appears in the very contradiction of the system. And I'm thinking today we had the occupational strike of the Polish parliament by the parents of disabled children. We are having now huge protests in the United States of teachers, and I think the protests are growing. We have a protest in health services, in healthcare, in the educational system in UK, the higher education system. And I think all those forms of protest have one thing in common. They are protests by people in the reproduction sphere. And this is one sphere of society that neoliberalism really took down. This is those jobs and the generally understood reproduction are the ones that went off wars under neoliberalism. Wouldn't you say that this might be one of the areas when we might look for a new possible class alliance or class subject in the generally understood sphere of the reproduction society? Not only jobs, but generally when we think about the urban space, many protests are about life, let's say, in urban spaces. Exactly.
So yeah, you reminded me that there is a good example over this period of time from 2000 to 2017 of a commodity that tripled in value at the same time as this other one fell by 1,000% in value, and that is the cost of getting a degree in Britain. So it's a perfect example of capitalism trying to replace falling cost with rising cost. But what produced it? Government policy. Simple government policy. They decided to, in order to this, it was a product of the austerity policy of the British government. So the cost of getting a degree went from, it was actually 1,000 per year in 2001. It went to 3,000 per year, and then it went to 9,000 per year. So in fact, it's by 9 times. That's pretty impressive. But any idea that that's a spontaneous outcome of the market is complete bullshit. It's government policy, and it's a choice. No, you are right that when you say reproduction, you mean the reproduction, reproductive labor, as Marxists would call it. So no. Yes. André Gortz, the French Marxist who I used to be very angry with, but now I think it was absolutely right.
Thank you.
He said, what's going to happen, in the same way that cinemas colonized the personal space on the Rosa Luxemburg's era, more and more of the micro interactions between you and as individuals have to be marketized for capitalism to survive. So, we saw in 2004 Cochabamba, the head of the water company leaving Cochabamba with his hard drive under his arm as the water company was stormed by the working class, because they hiked the price of water by a similar amount, 9 times. Okay, so we are now fighting against the invasion of marketization into our very lives. Your sex lives are being marketized, your friendships being marketized. Every interaction you make with other people, Gortz said, today there is sex work, there is prostitution. Soon in the future there will be friendship work. Well, that's now there. In Japan you get these people who are there to be modern geishas. They are modern friends. You pay for the friend. It's bizarre, but it's happening. Nail bars. Do you get nail salons in Poland? Do lots of women go and get their nails done? Did lots of women get their nails done 20 years ago? Not so many. Not in Britain, anyway. It's a new area of commodity. You do your own nails, The point Gortz makes is in the title of his book. Well, no, it's not. The title is The Critique of Economic Rationality. But he makes the point that there are limits to economic reason. After a while, you're going to say, no. Actually, the point of technology is to expand my area of free activity, not to reduce it and marketize it. And he also said something which I think relates to the question of the sustainability of tech capitalism, is micropayments for human services between 2 poor people does not produce technological modernity. So why so many cities survive is because the girl who works in Zara goes for lunch at Subway, and the guy at Subway saves up his money and buys a T-shirt at Zara. They are both low-paid, precarious workers. Neither is working in a technologically modern industry. And everybody's just surviving. Now, all this kind of invasive capitalism can do is ultimately make everybody more precarious. And that's why, for now, all the business models are actually based on giving things away for free. So Facebook gives Facebook services for free, Google for free, Amazon charges you rent, effectively, on or a kind of monthly thing, and monopolizes other businesses, so they take over Whole Foods in America, etc. It's based on acquisition and giving away. There's a limit to that. So the limits of this kind of economic rationality, I think, are there, and it means that the struggles are always about invasions of the person. And again, Gortz understood this. He anticipated that. We have to build a movement that simply says all these invasions that are coming at you like spikes on a radar. First, somebody is invading your privacy. Then somebody is invading your freedom to have the sexuality that you want. Then somebody says, you can't live here because it's being gentrified. Every one of these things provokes a struggle. Every one of these things provokes a kind of layered network struggle. And the movement from in itself to for itself happens when we conceive that there is a positive and holistic outcome to our resistance. And yes, I am trying to, that's the picture I'm trying to draw. The positive and holistic outcome isn't a nice thing to extra added bonus. It's what allows us to have a narrative. And in fact, when I've had discussions with the Polish left, the last 2 times I've been here, it's always been about what's the narrative. I believe that if the left across Europe can create a narrative about an outcome, it can resolve a lot of its problems. That I did this research for a book I wrote in 2007 called Live Working or Die Fighting. Looked at a sociological survey of young German workers in 1912. And in that funny German old-fashioned writing, what they always said was that they always talked about the Zukunftsstaat, the future state, the ideal that had been painted for them by the early social democracy was that the whole of their lives were focused on the future achievement of a kind of utopian state. I don't want us to recreate a utopian state, but I do think that the missing bit from leftism is what are we fighting for? And with, I said the other thing, one no and many yeses. I never liked that, but I could see why, because you don't want an overarching narrative. You don't want communism. You don't want meta-narratives that lead in the wrong direction. But there's no 2 no's. This is the problem. No to neoliberalism, no to far-right national xenophobic chauvinism. And so I think this has to limit the number of yeses. We can only focus on certain things to try and, whenever I'm on the doorstep campaigning for the Labour Party, which I'm a member of, it comes down to this. It's really my ability to say, look, forget this fucking bullshit about racism. Couldn't life be better if it was like this? And that works better than we can give you a 5% pay rise. And it certainly works better than appeasing the racism and xenophobia, which we cannot do. So, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Oh, this is somehow connected to previous questions, but you said what made Nazism so destructive was that the infrastructure was already there, made by the previous governments, right? Sorry? What made Nazism in Germany so horrible was that the infrastructure for destructive power was already there, prepared by the previous government. So now if we take all this power from these corporations and move it to the state, if we make this AI controlling all the traffic in Warsaw and London, if we give universal income, so we make everyone dependent on the universal income, not their own work, if we take over Facebook and make it publicly controlled, but it means state controlled more or less, if the state goes wrong,
yeah,
what happens? What would be how can we fight it? What's the possibility of rebellion? Because these big corporations, they do fall.
Yeah.
But if everything is concentrated in the state?
No, let me be really clear. I'm not arguing to concentrate everything in the state. And in fact, what I would prefer would be actually to break up Facebook. So it needs a state to do the regulatory act, to break it up and to keep it as 10 companies that can't take each other over, that must compete with each other. I personally would rather do that now than create a single state-owned type Facebook. But like I was saying with NEP and Lenin, unfortunately, if Facebook goes bust in 5 years' time, states will have to keep that infrastructure going because it's a huge infrastructure. But I prefer the peer-to-peer, small-scale, competitive, competing for energy, competing for innovation type thing. Like, given the choice, I would say do small-scale combined heat and power energy systems in newly built environmentally green housing projects is better because it gives us a chance of learning from each other and finding local control rather than let's recreate the Stalinist system. That's what I believe. So when I talk about the state, the state here has to intervene to keep what is good about the micro level innovative tech capitalism that we've got. I certainly wouldn't put the data under the control of the state. Nobody in their right mind would do that, but it's a very easy way of doing it. Just encrypt it. I don't want it to be I don't want Facebook to see my private secrets. I don't want my prime minister to see my private secrets. So we need the right to privacy. Somebody once said, I've forgotten who, that in the modern era, privacy is freedom in this sense. Freedom from someone else's ability to see your information. Now, designing that transition is going to be interesting as AI comes along, because AI is the thing that artificial intelligence is the thing that's going to really challenge Silicon Valley. Okay, I would argue that artificial intelligence can't tolerate 5 monopolies. Because what are they going to do? What is their AI going to do? Play chess with each other, play Go against each other. AI will lead to one monopoly. And in China, we know what that monopoly is going to be, the state. It's already said that the private sector must, by obligation, give all its data to the state. So the AI, people inside the AI industry understand the danger better than we do. In fact, if you watch what they're doing at the moment, they're frantically trying to create a civil society partnership that can have a discussion with them. They're basically saying, stop us before we kill you, because you don't understand how badly we're going to kill you. So please create ways. They're creating ethics boards, to control them. People in the AI industry I've spoken to say this: unless we can make a bargain with society where we don't destroy human rights and freedom, our technology is actually too dangerous to deploy. That's why we're not deploying it. There's no real big mass deployments of AI in the Western democracies yet. You haven't seen it really happen. Where it's been tried, say Google got the data of one hospital, children's hospital a renal hospital, kidney hospital in Britain, and it was seen as the example how they were going to use data, and it was really good use of data. They could find things in that data that was immediately valuable to everybody, and then they realized they destroyed everybody's human rights and they just had to give it up. Now that's taught them that probably a layer of the AI system is going to have to be publicly controlled. The ID, the thing that links my data to my identity, cannot be in the hands of a private state. Now, this is a kind of different debate than the one about post-capitalism. And as you said before, it's the one I'm trying to think about in my next book. But the starting point's got to be, if we're going to defend ourselves, who is the human that we're defending? What is the humanity that we're trying to defend? And the weird thing is that to throw a kind of another extra questionable statement onto the floor, like a bomb, the weird thing is how much the left has signed up to anti-humanism for me in the last 20 years. How many young people are prepared to say, we're already machines anyway. We have no freedom. We're controlled by algorithms anyway. And what I want to do is revive a debate about saying there is an alternative to that. There is a form of leftist humanism that doesn't have to be sentimental, folkish, playing with all the same themes as the right. There can be a form of moral philosophy and humanism that rooted in our experience that allows us to survive this, from which we derive principles like small scale where possible, which I started with in answering you. So should a train system be run on by 10 different companies? No. I mean, a railway system just works better if it's a single system, and the AI doesn't have to be that complicated. You don't need a supercomputer to run the Polish railway system. And I think what you would then do is say, well, how do you control? Who decides where the railway is built? Who decides what the prices are? Then you build. Then you can bring small scale activity like local residents groups or local user groups or the workers themselves into that mix to control. So in summary, I think we're not going to smash the state. We're not going to, we're not going to smash the state. We're going to control it, take it over in a democratized way, and use it to do this thing. That's this thing that needs to be done, which is controlling the transition from a highly unequal, uncontrolled info-capitalism to something I call post-capitalism, exactly because I don't know what it is. You know, in that sense, the post is like the negative diagnosis. I don't know exactly how the end's going to be, but I can see the middle. I can see what Warsaw would be like with a lot of cooperatives. I could see what it would be like if it had a really functioning welfare system and a public transport system that was cheap and under the control of the population. And if it didn't have, see, the other thing we haven't talked about is that these guys have gone there, but the beautiful info capitalism that functions not only has a load of low-paid supermarket and security businesses alongside it, it also has kleptocracy. You know, the Saudis and the Russian mafia and the Polish mafia, you were telling me, seized all these buildings when they were privatized. That's an essential part of modern capitalism, I would argue, and a dysfunctional part of it. And if we really had democratic control, we could actually put a stop to that.
Oh, yeah.
What you said right now and what you said previously about the Goldman Sachs executive that you talked to made me think that there's obviously a lot of people in the tech industry and in the other innovative areas that realize that we need a different kind of partnership between the industry, the economy, and the state, and who obviously realize that rampant privatization of all spheres of life isn't exactly good. But I think the problem is that they have all become so bound by short-term economic results that they realize we need this disruption, which they talk about, but they are actually afraid of disruption because it disrupts their profits. So the question is, when do they wake up, and if it's not too late?
Well, that's a great question, and I don't know Zuckerberg, and I've never spoken to him, but I have a well-informed imaginary view about what he's thinking right now, and that is this: please save me from Wall Street, because Zuckerberg is sitting there. First of all, you got the chair, Sheryl Sandberg, acting in a completely non-capitalist way. She's meant to represent the shareholders. What it represents the shareholders, she should sack Zuckerberg, because they used to say we can't imagine the end of capitalism. That's what Frederick Jameson, the theorist of postmodernism, said. It's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. Well, now, 10 years on, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine Sheryl Sandberg sacking Mark Zuckerberg. Facebook has to exist with Zuckerberg in command until he's a little old guy in a wheelchair, because we can't imagine. No, he can imagine because he knows the inside figures. What he needs to do is to stop Wall Street's analysts demanding short-term profits and allow them to completely reconfigure this company so it makes no profits for 5 to 10 years. Okay, that's what he needs to do. Can he do it? No. No, here again, the non-rocket science part of what I'm talking about is several governments, not only social democrats, but some liberal governments in Europe are now talking about how do we reconfigure company law in a way that allows us to, a lot of these guys want is a place to put the company while it survives the initial mistakes that it made. So in British Labour, we're now talking about drawing up a new form of Companies Act that allows a kind of company that has protection from bankruptcy, but can also protection from its shareholders. So there's not shareholder-driven capital, short-term, but long-term. Why do we feel the need to do that? If you look at company legislation 100 years ago, most of these Companies Acts were like one-page acts, and now they are, they're this thick. It's that kind of regulation. We can always change company legislation fundamentally because it needs to keep changing in line with the technology. Now, for everyone like that, who I think does understand that I'm pretty, I've got a pretty good, as I say, imaginary understanding of what his problems are. There's another one who doesn't get it. The guys who run Uber didn't get it. I mean, they just didn't get it to the point where they got in the cab with one of their own drivers and shouted at him on camera. I mean, that's how badly these guys don't get it. Silicon Valley wants the basic income, but for completely different reasons. It wants the basic income so that So basically, all services can be marketized, and we, with our basic income provided by the state, buy everything, healthcare, education, and they move into it. Why? Because, as you say, there are limits to capital, as David Harvey puts it, limits to capital. And once the limits to capital exploitation are hit in Uber, Facebook, and Airbnb, they need something else to go and marketize, and that something else is your healthcare system, your education system, your sex life. It's everything, and they need the right to do that. And we have an implicit belief that we are free and that we don't want our lives colonized by capital. So I think that's where that's effectively, for me, the class struggle of the 21st century. And by the way, the class struggle doesn't go away. Workers still go on strike. They still organize. The Uber drivers in Britain are organizing. The Deliveroo guys on their motorbikes, they're organizing. The cleaners are organizing. But what my point is not that they don't organize. My point is that the agent of change has to be something bigger than economic struggle in the workplace. And this is something that I believed in as a young kind of radical leftist. And 30 years ago, I was obsessed with the struggle in the workplace. And I just realized that it's not going to produce the dynamic that I thought it would. But that these struggles, which I'm incredibly inspired by, like Desi Fark, like Occupy, and like Me Too, they actually could change the world. You have to believe that you could change the world. Otherwise, Otherwise, what's the point? I know you want to say one more thing. Do you want to say you would just go on?
Yeah.
But then maybe we should.
Yeah, we'll be finished with that.
Because first of all, I don't. You say always we. I'm really. I have my problems to say who is the we. I wanted to convince my friends, my girlfriend, and so on, after this Facebook troubles we had, to change it. Don't you see? No, I couldn't convince nobody. So it's because this propaganda which is done by the other side, they are always stronger. Unfortunately, I would really like to join your enthusiasm. Paul, because I cannot just say, because I have the feeling that what we have now as capitalism, this financial capitalism, is already beyond the traditional capitalism. It's a question of power, of dominance, that a group of people, for example, 200 families from the French Revolution up to now in France, in Paris, are dominating the country in this form, in the other form, and the other form. And they will do it, I'm afraid, in the next. And there is no mercy. There is no way of, you don't believe it, that really these people who are in the position of power, they will give by. They wouldn't give by, no, not even a finger.
Okay. Well, so I want to try and also say that. So when I wrote the book, I said, unless you break with neoliberalism, the global system's going to fragment. And the Financial Times said, we like your technology predictions, but we don't like your predictions about the world. They're too shrill. I wish I'd have been shriller. I wish I'd have been more angry, because in a way, what's happening is the breakup of the global system. Trump, America first, Russia, breaking from the international system. And the other interesting thing is that what failure looks like is becoming really obvious. Failure looks like Moscow. It doesn't look like Beirut or Syria. A failed capitalism looks like a mafia capitalism right now. The rich get rich. Everyone else accepts they have no power whatsoever. The election's a joke. And all you have to do is make sure you don't go on the wrong side of the key mafia boss. And you don't, whatever you do, protest, or they're now torturing and arresting anarchists in Moscow. That's what failed capitalism looks like. It doesn't look like Cormac McCarthy's book The Road, like the planet's on fire. Now, the sad thing is that's going to be America if Trump gets a second term. So there'll be a failed capitalism in America. Now, in the end, Stefan Hessel, who wrote this book, it's called in French Indignez-vous, be angry, and it's said to have inspired the Occupy movement. And I wondered at the time why I didn't really like it at the time, but now I like the book. It's a little book, thin, more and more, because what he said is, what made us angry was not the depression, not the 1930s depression. We lived through it. We did nothing about it. What made us fight was not our membership of the left or the Communist Party. So what made us fight was being put in slave labor camps by the Nazis. Then we fought. We got angry because the Nazis came to our country, to France, and they put the youth into forced labor. And as you know, in Poland, they did worse. In other words, Hessel told us a very, and you know, that we should listen to all these survivors from the Second World War, told us a very profound truth about struggle. It's when people are pushed to the limit that they just get angry. I think Russia, I think President Erdogan in Turkey, and I think parts of Trump's America are pushing so many people so far that there is a narrative of resistance that we can do. Now, yes, they're powerful. And I think what is right about what you're saying is that we've never been in a society, probably since the aristocratic early 19th century, or maybe fascism, or maybe Stalinist Russia, where the asymmetries of power, not of information, but of power, were as great. We have big asymmetries of power. That's true. Now, what that means is that I think the dynamics of the struggle are going to be more uneven. It's going to be spikier. There'll be huge events like Gezi Park, huge events like the Egyptian revolution, and then nothing for long periods of time. And so the idea, you know, German social democracy with its schools and its libraries, and the Bund here in Warsaw with its schools and training colleges and its choirs, capitalism's almost decided it can't tolerate that level of counterpower. And you know, Karl Polanyi has this theory of capitalism that it has a power and a counterpower. I think what is true is that the requirement is for the organized counterpower to be weak, because the moment it becomes strong, they move against you, they move on, they can't tolerate you. That is the new problem of organizing. And yet, capitalism also, in most places, is not that efficient at the repression. What it actually requires, it requires you to buy the idea that you are not free. And therefore, there is a powerful counterpower to that. And that is simply the idea that we could be free is in itself a kind of mobilizing force. If I believed that, you know, remember, that's the Frankfurt School believed this, or Horkheimer and Adorno believed that capitalism was too powerful. In a way, Walter Benjamin, when he committed suicide, believed that the proletariat was no longer an opposing force, that bureaucratism had destroyed its ability to oppose, and therefore you're just in it forever. Orwell's 1984 book is about that. There is no plausible means of opposition that doesn't strengthen the rulers. If I believed that, what would I do? I might move to an island, but if I couldn't, I might try and find the most survivable form of capitalism. It's what Hannah Arendt does. She moves from Germany to America. America's survivable. It hasn't got madness that Europe has got. I'd do that. But I don't believe it. I believe resistance is possible. And I hope you do too, because I'll finish on this. Maybe we could just have a private chat afterwards rather than another round. But look, you're in an art gallery or a museum, and around you on the streets, graffiti. And you go to a party, do you meet drudges? Do you meet people walking along singing the Polish national anthem? Maybe you do, but I meet exciting people who want to learn from each other and live exciting and free and interesting lives. And I see art that is a critique of society. And I go to plays where every play I go to is a critique of the society. So I'm not actually so worried about people becoming Orwellian style robots. I just think that the penalties for losing are, and I think you're right, the penalties for losing the struggle are greater. The penalty for revolt and failure is Syria, and it's not Nazi Germany. You know, in the sense, in Syria, organized brutality forever. You know, that's the Orwellian outcome of the failed Syrian revolution, and so you need to do what you. Well, the other thing is it makes it obligatory to defend what you can of the international system. That's the other thing I've become convinced of. You know, any idea that you must retreat very, very slowly from the international multilateral institutions and reluctantly. Any idea of the left embracing economic nationalism or is wrong for me. You've got to have a multilateral, multinational. I'll finish on this. It was the British left which were one of the first people to have the idea of the United Nations, the League of Nations. A man called Leonard Woolf sat in an office of a tiny left-wing newspaper and wrote the design of international law. It was Virginia Woolf's husband. And we should own that creation. It's a very useful creation. The European Union, hate it though you will, is a useful creation. OSCE, all these things, NATO, even NATO is something that you can hold on to, because the moment it all breaks up and everybody's fighting each other, you don't want to be in that situation. I'll finish there, I think.
Well, I prefer to finish on the class struggle,
Go on.
but still, this were 2 hours packed with ideas and notions and data. And Paul, I would like you to join me thanking this crowd for following you up to here. And I would like you to join me thanking Paul for this very insightful, interesting talk.